it's so, we talk about this a lot, but I mean, Heidegger talked, one of the things he talked about or said was, in a dark time, truly dark time, isn't one where people are walking around dealing with how dark it is or talking about how dark out it is. So a truly dark time, right, is precisely a time that's so dark that it's dark that it's dark. It's dark isn't darkened, right? It's no one's talking about how dark it is, and no one's direct relation with its darkness. And I think he talked about that in like the 40s or the 50s, right? But there's this real uncanny way. It's like these ironic strange double unseeings or double blindedness, right? Where in our lifetime, so many fundamental things have changed, right? And it's changed so fast. Like, for example, I was thinking about this, that, if you watch the news and you notice that there's like there's a fire or an earthquake or, like there's some huge weather disturbance, right? Like every day practically around the world. And I'm noticing that I look at that and I'm sure other people go, uh-oh, look what we're doing. And I caught that the other day, just that sense about the way I look at the weather now has, in the way I kind of, in some sense, pre-reflectively consider it, is one that's directly tied to us. And what's interesting about that is that weather was always this thing that wasn't tied to us, right? That just happened. But there's this kind of strange relationship, right, to just in our lifetime, right, where weather was the thing that you were in some sense subordinate to, right? It had to respond to it, but it wasn't really responding to you. But that's no longer the case, right? When we watch the news, in some sense, much of the weather and the changes in the weather are in some sense a response to us. That's a really big change, right? And it's what's so interesting about it, it's hard to get it. It's similar to like the way we spend our time and get all of our information and our relationship information, in the last 20 years is just completely changed, right? It's changed relationships, like in the last 20 years, the way that you would meet your wife or your husband or whatever you called it, was you'd go out in the world and you'd live your life, and then you'd meet someone along the way, and then you get married. And that was just you didn't even have to think about it. That's just the way it worked. And now you shop for one, right? Dating sites, like that fundamental assumption about how you come about having a partner, for example, like that basic thing. People see it, right, as if they're shopping. And it's got this selective, predictive thing about it. And in some sense, I think these things are so basic, and there are things that are so deep, and they're changes in what we've always taken into the world for which we've always taken for granted. It's so many different of those what we used to take for granted has changed that I think it's almost impossible to actually comprehend it.
I'm just enjoying the sunlight
So gorgeous.
coming into my face.
Right.
The thing is, I mean, I really don't. I mean, I completely agree with everything that, and the first thing, right, when you say everything changes so quickly or has changed so radically quickly in the last 10 years or 20 years. But really, right, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution,
right,
that we suddenly you have cars and you have radios and TVs and all those weird things that were unimaginable, right, for the previous generation.
right.
For my mother, like if I tell you, yeah, I talked with this guy from Los Angeles while I'm scrolling, then that's just incomprehensible for her. Like, I mean, just just what's going on there. But I think, right, that what we are doing in a sense is that we just create one. I would argue just create one surrogate after the other. And the problem is that it's so quick and fleeting that at least the way I respond is I really try to get to those things that also I think Heidegger, for example, wants to hold himself in when he was strolling at the country path, namely those things that are in a sense eternal.
Right.
Like the sun rises every day and the crops grow every season. And because those, at least for me, those things rather give me a hold. Because I know I can, I know I can, in a sense, rely on that.
Yeah.
I can't rely on my smartphone. It's not a pillar for me because I know that maybe in a year or two it will be, it might not have effect, right? Because they are even constructed in a way that they don't hold for eternity, but just for a few years. And so is it with so many things today in our world. They also, and then we just buy a new thing. But that, right, that these are just surrogates. And especially when it's with human beings, with relationships, when they become surrogate-like, that you're just, right, I don't know, you live for 6 months in New York and then you have a few friends for 6 months there, and then you go somewhere else and then you have there some friends, but and maybe also with relationships then it becomes the same.
Right.
But that's so, it's so unsustaining, and ultimately it really can't nourish our being. And that's I think the great danger. That apparently, as you also said, no one's attending.
Yeah. And what was the last part you said?
No one's attending or responding to that. Only very few people are responding to that danger.
Right. Well, it's so interesting to think about, because I think one of the ways that we could one of the ways that we could talk about it, right, is we're not responding or attending, right? We are responding. You can't not respond, but we're responding in an attentive way. Precisely because I think that we're in some sense adrift to a way of being such that we can really have a genuine encounter with the world. And in encountering, right, is interesting to out a little bit, because to encounter something, right, on some sense is to recognize it, right? It's in some sense you know it enough such that you can recognize it. Yet it's in its recognition is simultaneously at the same time a drawing you in to in some sense resolve what is obscure. And so there's this double sense with a genuine encounter, which I think we mostly know, or the clearest example of that is like with the face, another's face, is we recognize somebody. And there's that recognition, or we recognize a gesture in the face, or an emotion in their face, or a sign in their face, right? And in that recognition, we're drawn in, but it's not like what's disclosed is on some sense recognizing a whole that then draws you in such that it can continue to disclose itself in the space between you. And if you think about what it is to recognize, right, that sense of to recognize something, is precisely what the child lives in.
Always disclosing this almost right this in between space is almost inexhaustible, right? I think that's also the reason why children, like when you look at them, they are constantly in awe and wonder about like the tiniest things.
Yep. Right. And it's that sense of it's interesting. It's got this sense of meeting. It's a meeting with wholeness. It's the world. It's the world that's first encountered, right? Like Merleau-Ponty talks about the face of the world. And I think what he means by that, right, is that it's still the case. However, we don't really dwell there anymore, although we do in our perceptions. But perceptually, what hits us, right, is what he calls the I think is, I can't ever say this word, the physiognomy of something, right? And it's not a disclosure of the features of something. It's the disclosure of the whole that then draws you in. It's yes, something like, right. And I remember this. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, and I think this is why I went through this period where I started to notice that I could shift my perspective and start to see like the living room or the backyard or the car or whatever the familiar spaces were. I could shift and see it like the adult saw it. And there was this period of time, right, where I kind of hovered between the two, where I was like, I could see it the way I saw it, or I could see it the way that the adults saw it. And I used to play games with myself where I'd be like, because I could shift it to seeing the world the way the adults saw it. And but then I'd fall out of it and I wouldn't know how to shift back. And so I used to try to figure out how to adjust just the angle of my perceiving such that the world showed itself right in terms of like, I don't know, dimensions or something, or things. When you look at when I remember what the way I saw it, right? And this is, I think I was probably about age 6 or 7, right around there. The world was a who. It wasn't a what.
But that's important.
It's like the trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
The
saw
trees.
the world instinctively. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
We live.
And it's funny because. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go on. That was excellent.
Yeah. Well, it's like it's striking because what that shows is that like our way of coming to know in the most primordial way, to coming to know the world, right, is a thou, is a character, is living, it's like a personality in which it's a meeting, it's a relation. And that basic structure, right? I think this is what Marcel Ponte really emphasized or tries to highlight or recover, is that still is the way the world shows up for us. In our perception. That overall kind of gestalt of that meeting that then you can recognize as a drawing in, such that that space between it can unfold and disclose.
So we might say that the space in between is this imaginal play space.
Yep.
Where that's also cool, right? We are also, it's both us that are drawn out, but it's also all the other beings that we, let's say, invite into that play space, that we also they also disclose something to us. So there's this mutual co-disclosure in the imaginal space by and right then that's almost creating another person in the room.
Yes.
Like the Tao of the Taos.
Right.
And right then just being almost becoming aware of that again, then that's what we try to hold open when we play and when we practice and when we do these sorts of crazy things that we are doing here.
Yeah. Right.
And that nourishes us.
Yeah.
That gives us a real hold a surrogate hold, but real hold.
Right. Because if you just like the child, right, in some sense, right. And what's interesting is that I don't want to like grandize the child or in some romantic way, but there's because it seems that what could happen is that we could develop that very capacity, can be developed, can be matured versus kind of atrophied. And I think that what you get in the child is in some senses that you see what is possible, right? When with a non foundational sense of things, right? Because if there's a foundational sense to maintain, right, then all the work is going to be about reifying that, ensuring that, shoring that up. But if there's more of a sense of a foundational less sense to things, I think what becomes possible is not a nihilism, right, but a depth dimension. And then and what's interesting about this, if you kind of keep playing this forward in some sense, is now language is now in some sense free to not shore up other signs, not to like to write and speak signs that are already describing and pointing to other signs that are already known in some sense. If that's no longer the pull, then it seems like language becomes something that participates in drawing out the inexhaustibility of the depth. It's not just pointing to something that's there, but it's actually, in some sense, drawing new forms of intelligibility, very similar to what I think Heidegger was trying to do with contributions.
That was.
I'm so intrigued with what Heidegger was trying to do there, like independent of whether or not he did it, right, or what it says, but whatever he was attempting there in itself is already saying so much. And I think that what I just said is another way of kind of pointing to that that possibility.
So right, language then always has this twofold character, both of, let's say, naming things, but also, right, this closing. So that was one thing that you pointed out.
Yeah.
And I would also say that, right, in especially in the metaphysical scheme, and you see some passages, for example, in Hegel, that this axis of moreness, so say that where he, for example, he tries to secure it, to hold on to it and grasp it. But I believe that's exactly what we ought not to do, but rather try to practice that holding such that there will always be disclosed more of that inexhaustible depth to us. But that's important. We can't secure it. We can only practice disclosing more of it.
Yeah.
And but the problem with that is that that also invites a certain vulnerability, because when there's always something more, then right, that can be very overwhelming. Then you because that then you can never. We have really have to take this notion of the off ground or the non-ground seriously. We really can't really can't if we take Heidegger seriously and the Buddhists and so, then we can never be secure, and we are actually never secure, because death might be the only that
Right.
we can be sure of that. But there is actually nothing that we can
Yeah.
ground ourselves at in the way we used to think about it. So there is actually
Right.
no security, and for the child, because the child doesn't care, and it's for the child, like, these things don't matter. But
Yep.
then when we grow older, then right, that is anxiety provoking, the whole thing talking.
Right. Right. And then there's going back to the sun, when you stopped for a moment and you said that right there. These very simple, but it like inexhaustively deep rhythms, right, of nature and the like. In some sense, would you say that that in the way that you were addressing the sun in that moment, in your relationship to that, and your daily walks, and then watching the change of nature, the inexhaustibleness, but yet the rhythms of it, is that a way that holding continues?
I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, today we can also, we can be scientific nihilists and say that the sun will explode in how many years, billions of years or so. But right, the sun was, for Plato, it was also the metaphor of good, that which is
Right.
right, that was the principle of principles, say, for at least for the Greek antiquity.
Right.
And I think we can and we should have right, we when we become aware of that principle, then we really believe it is good, and then we really want to hold ourselves in nearness to it.
Yep.
And think about it. Like, I thought about this yesterday, also during my stroll. There is almost this. There is, right. You mentioned it before with Merleau-Ponty. There is almost a faculty within the human being that wants us to find us to that, or wants us to respond to that as soon as we become aware of it. I believe that that's almost like this religious instinct that draws us towards reality,
Right.
that draws us towards what is real, and
Yep.
right, that and then also developing that faculty in the human being, let's say through practice, through ways of holding, through caring, all
Right.
these things that we love to do as human beings,
Right.
that sustains the nearness to the principle of the good. And I think
Right.
that is something that is so nourishing for us that we cannot not do it.
Right. Right.
and
Exactly.
and if we right we cannot, and I would argue also that is often what we, when that principle is out of sight, then right what we just do is we just are in a surrogate mode. We still want
Yes.
to do that because we are human beings and we want that, but we
Right.
just right we just create with that what you outlined before with the dating sites and the verification and all of that stuff that's so pervasive in our time, where we believe right we are deluded, we are cave people.
So interesting to be hearing this. You've mentioned it a couple of times, the surrogate, and then I'm looking at the sun and just imagining like having a surrogate son,
I mean,
right?
you can right you can have, if you're, let's say you're in a virtual world
Yeah.
and you have all the things right, your clock time, and they even right in some in some virtual games you have
Yeah.
even the simulation of night and day.
Yeah.
um so but maybe I don't know, more concrete I don't know, it would be like this is the thing that I'm orienting myself towards. But if in the mode of let's say pursuing surrogate, it would be like, I don't know, here's a bottle of vodka and I'm just pursuing that.
Yes.
That's like the star that I'm, all
Right.
my thoughts and actions are circled around.
Right. Or they did a study, and the study showed that if you go out and walk in the sun and think about Heidegger for 10 minutes a day, your heart condition improves. And therefore you have an app. And so you so you then it becomes, and then the sun becomes, right, the 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 means of click, like checking off that box better. Everything is just kind of more and more being organized in that way, right? I get a little bit worried about so much of the meditation and these kind of spiritual practices. You have to be careful, right? Because context is decisive.
That's true.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. I also see
Yeah.
that I saw from my I saw an advertisement for mindfulness practices here where I live, and it's kind of like they really do it. Yeah, you come to yourself, you find your true self, and that's
Yeah.
right. And then we find all of that practice again to the only ground we know, the subject, and find it back to it. But that's exactly not what practice should be about.
Right. Right.
It's never just about that. I don't know. You yourself find, I don't know, the rest, and that it's just about your own realization or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a very
Yeah.
shallow notion of all of that.
Right. That's why I stopped using a running app. Because I noticed if I used a running app and it tracked me, then I just started running to get my points. But that's not running anymore. Like, it completely changed the character of running. I used to run because I like to run.
we have to be very careful with applications and programs and these things. I
Yeah.
think they can be helpful in some contexts, but I mean, we are literally now depending on programs.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I but I think if you said context matters, but perhaps if we can really create an awareness for that principle again, then we might be able to overturn the ultimate
Oh
context
yeah.
of our time, which is the subject, and
Yep.
and perhaps see all things in a different light.
Yep.
There is this eerie notion in Dejanaro, where in one of his talks with Johannes, where he says what Heidegger experienced is almost, he compared it to this. It's almost as if from one moment to the other, you suddenly see all the limbs, like the nerves and the blood vessels and the limbs and the bones in your body.
Yeah.
It's like a complete shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And then Heidegger tried to hold open that completely other view to look at the world.
Yeah.
And
It's like the
I think,
negative image, right? It's like the negative image of a photograph, right? It's as if that's what I think that's what you were referencing, right? Was the way that Heidegger tried to, like, in some sense, just reveal the world in its negative image, right? You know, analogically speaking, and that view that he had, right, was there's a way that he caught sight, right, of something, or a way of seeing that disclosed things so deeply that he saw the same thing, but it revealed something completely different.
yeah, right,
Is,
not even,
is
not
that right?
What?
Am I following you?
It's right. It's even not something different. What was?
Uh,
Gangster.
yeah, some, modern day religious ceremony.
I think it's not something completely different. Something. Right. The principle is always there. We've just forgotten.
Yeah.
It has been, right. It has been very strong for the Greeks.
Yeah.
But in our time, we are almost capable of.
Right.
But right,
Speaking of it,
that faculty
yeah.
of the finding of the religiosity of the thirst for reality, right? Because that's still there, it's just going into other directions, right? We become para-religious or develop para-religious institutions, and we all have all that religious passion, let's say, in sports or in music or in idols or even in companies, right? So many things. That, of course, that can also then become very dangerous, right? If we don't have
Right.
if we don't have a symbol and an organized world. So that's not also one thing, right? For Plato, there was always the issue: how can we, let's say, participate with the principle of the good?
Yep.
But right, what
Yeah.
it's doing, it's emanating through all beings, in a sense, in a kind of likeness.
Yeah.
So there is a likeness of, let's say, the divine in all beings. And even think about Heidegger's notion of fourfold, right? Let's say there are these organizing poles of heaven, earth, mortals, and gods. But all these things are, in a sense, right? All beings hold themselves in a likeness between those four poles
Yeah.
and are only thanks to those four poles.
Right.
But today,
Right.
let's say, right, that participatory connection between the principle, let's say the sun and all other beings, that has also been eradicated. And that process is mainly thanks to nominalism.
Right. In nominalism, remind me again what nominalism is again.
So nominalism is basically there are just singular beings, but there are no overall patterns
Yeah.
that
Okay.
that connect those. So think about, for example, one direct consequence of this was in the Middle Ages, the kings and the rulers justified their power by saying, look, there's the divine, and the likeness of the divine is also within us. So let's say there's a top-down connection between the divine and let's say the way we organize hierarchy. And then with secularization, that justification then went away. And nominalism really had a big impact, for example, in how we think about governance and the state. Because then then it was just bottom up, so to say. Just right, we have democracy in this. This sounds almost as if this is a bad thing. it's just we completely turned the way we see and look at things.
Yeah.
But then there's no likeness, no participation with those patterns.
Right.
That permeate through all of reality.
Yes. Yes. And in some sense, those patterns, you could say, are experienced primordially to the child. It's those patterns that is that meeting of the face, right, of the world. I was you can tell I've been reading Marcel Ponte again, because he keeps coming to mind. He's talking about the way that the child comes to relate to colors, and that to attend to colors, right? What the child does isn't, because if you look at it like this, it's like how we acquire like perceptions of color, or how we learn our first word, right? If you stay a Cartesian, you're just going to end up in these epistemological riddles, right? Right, where it's like, well, how does the child learn its first word if it doesn't already have other words by which to understand what that first word, right? And so like most of the child's first grasping of the world, that way later than they start to make propositions about, have to do with precisely, I think, what Vervaeke is highlighting about the classical notion of knowledge being the conformity with reality. That there's something, I see if I could describe it, that there's a way that the child understands the color by undergoing a reconfiguration of consciousness, right? Such that consciousness is able to grasp or behold what it's seeing in such a way that the color can become explicit to it and stand out. And he says is like, then what ends up happening is that when once you start to see color, when the child thinks back to before they see colors, they remember it as if they saw colors through the whole thing, because, right, they've undergone this conformity, right, with the world as a I forget the exact terminology, but it's something like a reconfiguration of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
That afforded them to be able to see colors, right?
Mm.
It's that sense of things of like, I think that's really, I think what I'm getting that we're, with this dialogue that we're having keeps circling around, right, is precisely that, this, right, this this way that the world in some senses much reaches into us, right? Even probably more so than we are reaching into it. And that I kind of feel more and more as I get older that like there may be a kind of ethics or ethos in really being a human being, is really kind of in such a way is to is in some senses to let the world reach you.
And that's really great and important. And think about, let's think maybe again on this in-between space, because right, when we think about, again, thinking about the patterns, right, and how the in-between space between ourselves is right, is alive. It's
right.
It's that which affords everything. We're not just, right, we're not just like, I don't know, we're not two Cartesian blocks that, I don't know, that clash onto each other.
Yeah.
But there's a real possibility of exchange in mutual disclosure,
Right.
mutual revelation. And
Yeah.
that in nominalism, it would be just like, I don't know, I hit a rock or so, and it's just the way we interact is just mechanic.
Yeah.
Just it's a very sterile notion of how beings interact in the world. Similar, right?
Yeah.
That space, let's say, between the sun and myself is empty and void, and there's actually nothing there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's
right.
just rarefied nothingness, and that's it. It's cold. Right. That's why I really liked how John described in the meaning crisis series. He described it the death of the universe. This so cold, indifferent space.
Yeah.
There are
Totally.
the only real thing are like the nominalist notions of, let's say, right, just what is in the beings, entrenched in them. But all the moreness is, that's all gone. Like,
right. So I'm here. Is it something like this? Is it something like the state? Feel the differences between these two statements. Like nominalism would be something. I have eyes, therefore I see. and versus I see, therefore I have eyes.
I would say let's maybe
It's kind of like
first,
kind of like I was thinking about that, because it's like we have eyes, right? It seems like it's nominalism would be, well, I happen to have this thing called eyes, therefore like I can see as a function of that thing I have eyes for. But it seems that doesn't make any sense, because something like seeing, right?
I would say, right, if contrasting that, the best sentence would be that sentence from Meister Eckhart. The
Right.
same eyes with which I see God are the eyes with which God sees me.
Yeah.
That's how deep the participation could be.
Yeah.
The same eyes
Yeah.
with which I see the sun are the eyes with which
Right.
the sun sees me.
Right. Because
That's
you're
what I would offer as a counterposition to nominalism.
yeah, totally. This deep participation is something that it sounds, I'm getting this sense, it's like really we arise from it. It's like, it's almost like the in-between, the intertwining, the meeting, in some sense, is it creates the two meeting. It's almost like the meeting is first in some regard.
Yes, yes. The relation
It's
is
interesting.
more primordial than the what is it called? I think the relates. So like the things that the relation is binding together. The relation is more primordial.
Yes, yes. And that perceptual shift, right? Because you can see it, right, by the fact that there is something called nominalism, right? And by the fact that there is something called Buddhism, right? I think tells us that there's a way that you can comport yourself such that you could actually see and hear these deeper relational patterns as primary and start to see the patterns.
Yes. Right, that we can never, right, the relation can never be really objectified.
Totally.
The binding can always only be practiced and enacted. And
right.
That's, I think, there's then also where we perhaps become aware of the principle.
Yeah.
That affords all of these findings, responses, and relationality.
It looks like I'm about to run out of battery.
Yeah, me. I'm also. I spent almost 60% of my.
This was fun.
Yeah, it was very. The weather is excellent.
Cool experiment. Let's do this again.
Yes.